Another amazing guest. Actually, today is also a guest who is a friend of mine. We have John Lechner with us. John is a writer, researcher. He wrote an amazing book, really amazing book on the history of the Wagner Group, and the title is That Is Our Business. We're going to talk a lot about his book. We're going to talk about his journey and other interesting things that are happening in the world right now, such as in Ukraine. John, thank you for joining me. Finally, we could do this.
Thanks for having me. I'm trying to think about like when we first connected because it's been years and years now. Yeah.
Yeah.
That so this is very cool too to finally be on the show.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we've talked about it many times. I think Marcel introduced us.
I think that's right.
So, John, tell us a little bit about, what's your story? Like, how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah. I mean, I think I was always a guy who loved languages and linguistics. I had some time before going to college and I went and lived in Russia. And when I got to college, I kind of wanted to become a Russian studies major and specialize in post-Soviet history and different languages from the former Soviet Union. And then, of course, like a lot of idiots, I thought that I should just go into investment banking after all of those,
I
you
mean,
know.
well, you and I did the same thing. So,
Yeah. I was like, oh, I have these like unique niche intellectual interests. I'm sure like Wall Street is where I can really pursue that.
yeah.
I did that for about 6 years and really couldn't ever kind of align my interests. I mean, there are aspects of working in banking that are really exciting or fun. It is like 100 hours a week too. And over time, I think that I realized that my passion in my free time was trying to learn Chechen or, reading about things that are going on in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Eventually, I had to kind of align what I was doing with what I was interested in. And so I came down to DC, worked a little bit for a think tank, especially on Turkey, and then ultimately became kind of an independent writer and journalist. And I first started visiting the Central African Republic in 2019. For me, initially, I was mostly just interested in the combination of African history, African politics, and my background in Russian history. And I was just interested in how these kind of very different societies are coming together and interacting with each other. I quickly realized how complex the Central African conflict it was itself. And so, in order to understand how Wagner was operating within that environment, I set out to really understand the Central African Republic and traveled all throughout the country, developed a big network. And I knew I wanted eventually to write a book about this. And so, I continued doing field work all the time in the Central African Republic, went to Libya, to frontline Ukraine, Syria, Serbia, and over time kind of developed a relationship with some of these guys in Wagner that led to kind of more sources and was able to kind of put together this book that is very character driven and based on interviews with these guys themselves.
Mhm. Based on real people, real stories. That's really what I like about, I think you did like 100 interviews or something like that.
I
Which
probably
is,
interviewed like 40 guys who were and women who were affiliated with Prigozhin's network in some way. So, the bulk of them were guys who were kind of fighters within Wagner or commanders, but also a mining executive, some people who worked for his media companies, academics who worked for him on just, feasibility studies, these types of things.
which is very interesting to hear because you wouldn't think that he would play academics, but it was very professional, a lot of his operations.
I mean, I think we can go into the whole sort of otherization that occurs, at least initially. Not a lot of what Prigozhin was doing in Africa, especially when he first touched down in Sudan in 2016, kind of really kind of building stuff up in 2017, Central African Republic in 2018. He was engaged in military training. This is something a lot of other governments do. A lot of PMCs and private security companies provide. and he was interested in mining and minerals, something that a lot of foreign companies are interested in
Mhm.
Africa. So, in order to understand where he would hire Russian academics to go there. And this isn't something that is foreign to Western universities and
Mhm.
Africa departments either, just as it is in the US. The universe of people who kind of cover Africa professionally in Russia is relatively small. You would be a professor and you would get, hey, how do you feel about, 3 months in the Central African Republic? You get to do your studies fully funded trip. And these guys are like, yeah, of course. They jump at
Yeah,
the
yeah.
opportunity.
Well, that's super interesting because that's one thing I wanted to give you some props for because I mean you and I talked about this privately often. I don't want to go as far, but it always the sentence "the death of expertise" comes into my mind when I talk about these topics, which is there is this legion of people that talk about, especially in the security space and in Africa, but also in the Middle East and elsewhere, let's say like the global south in general, where they become the expert because it's fashionable and it's in the news and people want to know about it. And there's so many experts that are in universities and on the ground, but there's not that many people that get immersed into the culture, the people, the topic that they're researching. And for you to learn even a local language in the Central African Republic, which I think is alien for most people to even think about doing that, right? And how many people have worked in many African countries and never picked up a local language? I think majority, to be fair here, but this has been always my problem with a lot of the Western researchers, which is, looking at problems like terrorism, or they look at the Middle East, but they don't really understand the culture or don't even speak the language. And this was the same when the Ukraine war happened. There were so many experts, but none of them spoke Ukrainian or Russian. Sorry if I went a little bit on a rant there, but what's your opinion on that disconnect? And can you like tell us a little bit more about how that has also impacted your book and your research?
I don't want to claim ownership over, the right way to do things. I think for me, the thing that was natural was to play to what I consider to be my strengths, which were sort of learning. I love learning languages. I love learning about languages. And that automatically gives you sort of a little bit more of kind of like an anthropological approach to thinking about people. You're naturally interested in how one community is slightly different than the other. They might speak a different dialect. They might say things, how does that affect the sociolinguistics and identity? So I'm fascinated by those very tiny things. And I think it allows you to ingratiate yourself with people and show that you deem their culture and history and language worth the effort of studying and the work that you have to put into it. I think partially, that's great for me because I also am bad at a lot of things, like anything with regards to technology. So like I don't like and I still don't know like how you would go about like tracking planes and stuff like that. I'm just not particularly interested in those details. I'm interested in how people are kind of perceiving the world around them and how they are kind of rationalizing what they're doing and positioning themselves. That was kind of the approach that I took, and the approach was that you really have to therefore be on the ground, seeing things for yourself and meeting people and trying to understand where they're coming from. And that included meeting with guys in Wagner. It included meeting with, the armed groups that were fighting against them. I think over time that also allowed me a degree of access that would be difficult because for most people who are journalists or experts, right, who are working on a story, right, about Wagner or, a paper or a research paper or something like along those lines. They land in Bangui. They have to research something where the parameters are kind of set. They have to ask certain questions, especially if you're a journalist. And then you go, and there's nothing really ever new being produced about Wagner. And I had the luxury of going and meeting with those guys and then not writing about things. And my questions could be a lot more about what are you doing with regards to tensions in this community in the northeast of the Central African Republic, migration routes of cattle and how it's affecting the farming communities. And those were things that they wanted to talk about. And it wasn't like someone coming up to them and saying, well, what about the human rights abuses? What about this and about that? Obviously, the human rights abuses are in the book and everything, but I was able to then get much more of how they worked and what they were trying to do, which I think a lot of folks were always missing. They were analyzing the results of Wagner's operations, human rights abuses, displacement, but they never were that interested in what they were trying to do or how they viewed they were doing what they thought they were doing.
I really liked the approach of the book. Also, I think there is a callousness in internet discourse. I don't think I'm saying something new there, but where you mentioned this now, the otherization, right? Of yes, there is a war in Ukraine. Yes, Wagner is involved. Yes, Wagner is involved in a lot of bad things in Africa. But at the end of the day, it's human beings doing these things. And to understand the results, it's important to understand the people behind it and in what context this is happening, because it's not happening in a vacuum. And my point also is in this, how do you deal with, or even do you deal with, or you haven't even experienced it, the opinion of certain researchers or many researchers, particularly in the West, saying you're ingratiating yourself too much with these types and you are, quote unquote, gone native. I know it's not correct thing to say anymore, but how do you deal with that? Because conversations we've had about this topic before.
You can't really pay attention to them because they really don't know anything about usually the topic at hand. There's very few people out there, and I don't want to denigrate the others who are doing this, but very few people are out there producing new research, producing actual field work about what's going on in these places. I mean, there are good reasons for it. It's dangerous, and these guys can be scary, but I think hopefully what this book shows was that it was possible. And the part of me that is a journalist is supposed to go after and try to get every interview and get as much of the story as is humanly possible. And one of the ways that you go about that is by ingratiating yourself. I think it's important for people to see the stories in here because so much analysis is always kind of these kind of anthropomorphized units of Wagner wants this, or Russia is in Africa for this, and China is there for that. And all of these countries, organizations are made up of individuals and represent the sum product of their competing, often kind of interests and lobbying and efforts to persuade others. And so by getting the stories of these individuals, I think we see a lot more about how these interventions came about, how they changed over time, the obstacles that they faced, and the fact that very often they are reacting to events on the ground. This shouldn't be surprising, but it goes against some of the narratives of Wagner sort of just being in control of these African countries. I mean, they're complex conflicts in ecosystems. No one is in control. The other thing too is my job was to learn as much as possible to write about the history, and it's other people's jobs to do what they want to do with that information. Remember kind of the first years of 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq. There were these moments where, you know, to try and understand where a terrorist was coming from was equivalent to being sympathetic to like Al Qaeda. And that didn't do us many favors when it came to understanding the places that we were getting involved in. So I think this is the same way. If you don't understand how these guys are thinking, then you don't actually have any clue what's going on. And you're constantly going to be surprised. I mean, the same people who would criticize me for talking to Wagner are the same people who are surprised when more and more countries in Africa are partnering with them. Because if these guys are only there to create chaos and take advantage, and then why are African governments partnering with Russia right now? If you want to actually understand why these things are happening, you have to understand where people are coming from.
Yep, absolutely. There's also a bit of like infantilizing Africans,
Oh, totally.
right?
Totally.
Like they don't have any autonomy or wherewithal to make decisions that is good for them. And I think a lot of people in the West should ask themselves how good or how bad was France that it got pushed out so quickly.
Yeah.
Right. So these are things that we need to think about. Even organizations like you mentioned, the Central African Republic. I mean, the abuses under the UN, right, are horrific. And I don't see any articles on that. And I'm not even talking about the latest mission, but even the ones before. So I think people underestimate the deep-seated scars and valid arguments a lot of African countries have against a Western intervention. I mean, it's hilarious also, especially because we at Great Dynamics, we are very focused on Africa. And I worked there for many years, but not understanding that there's legitimate problems that a lot of African countries have with Western intervention. And to call China or Russia even neo-colonialism is silly, because it doesn't show the magnitude of what colonialism really was and what the Chinese or the Russian, and they're different obviously from each other, but what their activities in Africa entail.
I think the issue, again, this is, I think, also how I was able to meet with these guys in Wagner and write about what they were doing, was I always tried to cover the whole ecosystem. So especially when I was working in car for 6 years, and I think what they found interesting was that I was interested in what their place was within the overall ecosystem of the conflict. I think very often what you see in kind of poor analysis of international affairs is this desire to somehow try and isolate and analyze the behaviors of a single actor in a given environment, whether that's Wagner in the Central African Republic or, Russia in the world, China in the world, and hold constant, you know, let's say West, well, what the West is doing, what America is doing. And the reality is that everyone is reacting to each other, the perceptions
Mhm.
of what the other is doing. And the perceptions are often very misguided. We all live in this environment where we don't know exactly what's
Yeah,
going on.
yeah,
And access to information is asymmetric. And very often we just simply don't know what we're doing. I still have no clue what it is I'm doing, but you have to look at how what Wagner's adversaries or what their perceived adversaries are doing in order to understand how they're acting
Mhm.
as well. And I think that that other component is often not even really mentioned.
You mentioned technology and that not being your strength. Do you think that the advent or the access, some would say democratization of technology, has obviously made it a lot easier to access for more people and to be involved, which is great? How do you think it impacts how we do research, how we do analysis, and has it pushed us away from these dynamics, this understanding of these actors on the ground? I mean, I'm asking you a lot of questions in one. Sorry for that. So even I most of the time don't know what I'm doing. But what I'm trying to understand from you is, Do you think it was a help or a hindrance that you didn't have access to flight tracking or, social media analysis or any of these things? Because I see that a lot of the other books lean more on that than, interviews and
Yeah. I mean, I was just lucky that there are people out there who are good. And when we talk about kind of the OSINT, I think the quality, it seems to, ranges kind of from
Mhm.
all over the place.
Yeah.
I think, I always worked very closely with my friend Jack Margolin, who
Mhm.
is very much kind of a true expert in kind of that digital space and
Mhm.
digital tracking.
He's been on a podcast.
Oh yeah, I
Yeah.
bet. Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. The more of the
Yeah.
small
Oh,
when it
he's
comes to this
awesome.
stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
He's great, and so he and I, as he'll tell you, like we were meeting like probably every other Friday for coffee and just talking about what we're seeing and what we're hearing. And I think my strength was, I guess, probably a little bit more what you would consider like human kind of
Mhm.
intelligence, human sourcing.
Mhm.
And I think you need a marriage of both.
Sure.
And so there's a big notes section in this book with all of my citations, and so I certainly cite the incredible investigative work of others who are doing that kind of tracking and know how to use satellite info. I do think that that is always one piece
Mhm.
of the puzzle. It can offer you a snapshot or a glimpse into a particular moment in time and what's going on. But
Yeah.
to get the context around is
Mhm.
also important.
Yeah. Absolutely. In the book itself and the experience of writing the book, which interview and what trip impacted you most?
Well, man, it was always wild. I loved the Central African Republic just itself, the people, the cultures, how people like survive in this environment that would like I would be dead in like 2 seconds if like I was had to live there like the resilience of people. It's just insane how they're able to navigate this environment. And for them it's perfectly natural. It's not necessarily like people know that they're very poor and that the
Mhm.
Central African Republic is different than other countries, but they're experts in navigating their own home environment that
Mhm.
is governed in a very different way to what we are used to, for example.
Yeah.
So traveling in the rural Central African Republic, the Northeast, in the Southeast, in areas that were under rebel control, in areas where Wagner was operating was kind of always a surreal moment. Meeting with Wagner in the Central African Republic was always kind of a surreal moment, and one that even though I was like fairly confident, I was always happy like when the plane was, taking off from Bangui because you're like, "Oh, I'm not gonna get."
Yeah.
I never thought I was gonna be like disappeared, um,
I mean, you came
because
close.
I was disappeared in Mali, yeah, for
Yeah.
sure, that was different, so that was another surreal moment where that obviously affected me and my family where,
Sure.
I was in Bamako and thrown into a car blindfolded and disappeared for a few days, at a black site, and that is a strange moment when you actually have a blindfold over you and you're like, "Oh, like, this thing that I've seen in movies is, like, currently happening to me."
I mean, you can laugh
Uh,
about it now.
yeah, well, it
You
was
know.
weird then.
Yeah. Yeah.
It was, I think it became much more difficult for my family because
Mm.
pretty quickly after a point, I knew I was with Malian intelligence.
Mhm.
But I mean, as I'm sure your listeners know, this is also an area where Al Qaeda and ISIS affiliates are active and where kidnapping is a pretty lucrative business. And so,
Yeah.
they didn't know who I was with. And so that was very scary. I mean, those trips were fascinating and certainly thrilling in different ways. Obviously, going to the front lines in Ukraine is a pretty singular experience. Libya too, getting into Benghazi was very kind of surreal. I feel lucky that, I've had the opportunity to be on the ground in these places and meet people.
Yeah, because for in all the years that you were working on this book, obviously, we checked in, and I remember you telling me about the Mali situation. And the funny thing was, I was working with a couple of American journals, and they said, "Oh, John Lester was," and they didn't know I knew you.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
yeah, he was grabbed, and I was like, "Yeah, yeah, I'm aware."
yeah.
And
A lot of people were aware.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah, but I don't think a lot of people knew you were writing a book.
no, no, I wasn't. I don't think I was like I wasn't massively advertised. I mean, the people who I worked with in this space knew kind of
Mm,
what I was up to, but it wasn't something that I announced. And again, like I really
mm,
tried to keep a very as low a profile as possible
mm,
to write this book because I wanted to get as many interviews with Russians and other conflict actors as possible before kind of I announced in any kind of meaningful way that
mm.
I was writing a book on this because I felt, um, but it turns out that there's something strange about interviewing people for a book that is both just not very threatening, I suppose,
Mhm.
because
Mm.
not a lot of people read
Yeah.
books, I guess, or I
Yeah,
guess
fair
not.
enough. No, that's true. Yeah.
And so there, it wasn't like this thing is going to show up tomorrow on CNN, and
Mhm.
so people were more willing, and I guess to a certain extent too kind of flattered about the idea of being in a book versus
Yeah.
being in like a news article, which I didn't realize that was going to be an advantage at first, but
Mm.
uh, it definitely was. And so I tried to keep out of, to a large extent, to keep out of, being like very publicly in the discourse about,
Sure.
these types of things.
Smart. I think also if people know that it's out there that you're doing it all of a sudden, they start also asking for money and a lot of money,
Oh, yeah.
which is always a thing in these places.
I think people probably think that a book is far more lucrative
Yeah. Right?
than the reality.
I don't know how to express this, but I really love this book.
Thank
You
you.
did a great job, man, really. And I know you gave me like a copy before it's coming out on the 4th of March. So by the time you hear this episode, the book is out. And I talked about it in the newsletter too, and there was a lot of interest in it. But I will say, uh, it's so refreshing because, as you mentioned about the whole, often we speak about problems and issues and phenomena in the world as an abstract,
Mhm,
right? And we don't really get into like what are these drivers, who are the people behind this, right?
mhm.
And I think you did such an amazing job. I made a promise. I don't know if you remember this, but this is already a couple of years ago. But I made a promise, even because I know other guys that you and I both know has written books on Wagner, which are good. But I said, this is, I knew from the get go, also just from knowing you and how you and your process, that I don't even know, like, this book is going to be a bestseller. And I think I'm already looking forward. I mean, we talked about maybe your next book and all
Yeah,
that kind
yeah.
of stuff,
Which will
but
not be about Wagner, by the way.
right.
We're done. Like
But
we've done that thing.
that's what I really found fascinating. And some of the characters in the book, like Durant, that works closely with Eric Prince, who is a very polarizing figure. Can you tell a bit more about your experiences with him? Because I thought that he made a lot of sense in the book, and he clears up a lot of things. Obviously, it's always who to believe,
Mhm.
but yeah, can you go in a bit more on that?
Yeah, and I mean, this is why I think it's important to get these guys' stories, and I put these stories out there because they are operating, logically according to their principles or the principles of the business in which they work, covering the Libya section. The Libya section, which folks can also get a piece of, there's an excerpt in the Baffler. And again, this is about putting Wagner in a bit of context too. for Haftar's offensive on Tripoli that started in April of 2019, Wagner was one of all kinds of actors who were showing up. They were not the only private security or mercenaries that were there. And so I've talked with and shared the stories of some Wagner guys who were there fighting at the time. One of the Syrians who they recruited from Assad-held Syria to fight in Tripoli. The Turkish PMC Sadat was also active on behalf of the Tripoli government, bringing in about 5,000 Syrians to fight on the front line from Turkish-held parts of Syria. And I mean, you had Chadian mercenaries, Sudanese, both
Chechens.
Arabs, Chechens, you had Darfur rebel movements all fighting for, and it's not surprising. I mean, these PMCs and Western PMCs, they work in places where there's conflict. That is like the business model, right? You can't sell your services to a country that's at peace. There was a story that had come out, I can't remember when it came out, but at the time it was that Eric Prince and his guys were active in Haftar territory and were selling their services, and something went wrong, and the guys had to escape on an inflatable boat. Yeah, on a little dinghy from Benghazi. They made it like 200 nautical miles to Malta, and they show up, and you can imagine what these guys look like, right? And they claim to be fishermen, and the Maltese authorities are like, no, no fucking way, like, and so I had met Prince. Again, I just tell people that I want to tell what happened and your side of the story. He put me in touch with his good friend Christian Durant, and what Christian said, as he mentioned, it made a lot of sense. Christian at that point had started his own company. He left Prince's Frontier Services Group, which was active in Africa, and to start his own company, Lancaster 6, and they were working in Jordan potentially to do some security work in Syria, which fell through. And then a Libyan contact of theirs kind of let them know about this opportunity to provide security in Libya. And one of his principles, which makes a lot of sense in this space, is that he said usually the first mover gets the chunk of the business. Basically, he said we touched down not exactly knowing like who we were going to contract with. They were speaking with Haftar, they were speaking with the National Oil Company of Libya, and they were also speaking with what he calls U.S. government logistics, Benghazi, which I'm sure our listeners could you know it wasn't U.S. aid. So they eventually contract with Haftar, and they bring in these helicopters and planes that Christian, had contacts with in Serbia and in South Africa. They bring it in, and according to Christian, Haftar wants him to basically attack Tripoli, and which was not what they had in mind. I think they were much more interested in guarding, probably some assets, oil fields. So they decided to get out of Dodge. But, according to him, the folks at the UN then decided to launch an investigation and wanted to tie Eric Prince in with it as well, because the crop duster had formerly belonged to Frontier Services Group. And he felt that the investigation was politically motivated because, according to him, he's like, you have US government logistics operating in Haftar territory. You got Haftar getting supplied with weapons from the French government and I think the British government, and you're complaining about us with a crop duster with like maybe a little bit of outfitted. But that was kind of the story that they provided. Christian, he has his own book and he's looking for a publisher, which is actually, I've read some of it. It's very good. I mean, he's done some pretty crazy stuff. So yeah, he's done some interesting stuff.
And to be fair, I mean, I don't know the man, but I will say this. When that UN monitoring group for Libya report came out, if you remember, it was widely criticized, if not ridiculed, for the lackluster analysis and cutting corners.
Oh, they totally. Yeah, they totally cut corner, and then, as I put too in the book, that they were brought to court, both Eric Prince and Christian Durant were brought to court in Austria, and the whole case was thrown out based on just there was really nothing there. So I think he did have a point that there were motivations at that time
Mm.
in going after Prince and after Christian, no matter what you think of Prince.
I mean, I remember when President Trump was elected again, from people I know in the PMC and the contractor world, there was a lot of champagne bottles popping because they believe that there will be a lot of opportunities and the US intelligence community and defense would, or maybe sidelined because of quote unquote deep state ties. I'm not saying this. This is coming from the camp of Trump. Where do you think, in the light of your research and the conversations you had, where do you think the Trump administration is going to go, particularly looking at places like Venezuela, Ukraine? It came now out that Prince allegedly suggested a plan to set up forced migrations and putting people in camps and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, what is your opinion on
I think that any good private security company or private military company looks to what the greater threat narratives are and positions themselves in a way that they can get business. That is, just the basics of what the business is of supply and demand and how you should be marketing yourself. I think, Eric Prince is very astute when it comes to, where those potential kind of
it?
opportunities
He
are.
really is, actually.
Yeah. And I think a lot of those proposals end up not, they're proposed and
Mm.
like all of us when we're out there advertising, you throw a lot of things out there and, you hope that something sticks. But I agree. I think everyone kind of, certainly like intuited that Trump's re-election would be a boon for the private security sector. It's difficult to say exactly though how like the mechanics of it are going to play out. I mean, if we just take Africa as an example, right? There have been a lot of PMCs, Western PMCs, who again they recognize the narrative, the threat narrative of Wagner growing Russian influence in Africa, and they have been, pitching Western governments saying, "Let us be, a friendlier Wagner for you."
Mhm.
Let us, go in, partner with these governments so that you prevent the Russians from coming in with this type of structure. It hasn't really happened. And the reason that it hasn't really happened is they weren't really able to, the governments, including the US government, to bite on it, at least to the extent that they would be willing to fund it. And Prigozhin's advantage always, we discuss it a lot in the book, but he was both a businessman who would invest his own money, but he also had a relatively privileged position within the state that he could also move and get subsidies, especially to start things up. And often those kinds of subsidies would dry up over time, and he was expected to become self financing. But it allowed him sort of this like startup money to play around with that these other PMCs don't have, and these things are expensive to start up, and the economics don't really work even with kind of the mineral concessions that everyone always like, has such a, get so much attention. It's really debatable how much, Prigozhin was making in terms of those
Yeah.
concessions. No, it's just the issue of the economics, whether the economics are attractive.
Yeah, you're 100% right, because it was not like he was outside of Sudan, because I think in Sudan,
I think he made some money.
economics,
Yeah.
I think that there the economics would work, and perhaps in Central Africa.
And they weren't doing as much. They were just providing training, right? They're not
Exactly.
providing a
Yeah.
full counterinsurgency force. Yeah.
Um, but if they like, this is the question that's always been asked, like uh, TRC, right?
Yeah.
Because that there it would make sense.
But it's still a tough model to work, right? Because
Absolutely.
if you think about the best way to think about these things is like cash flow, right? if your cash flow is coming from digging something out of the ground, often in a conflictual environment, and we're talking about the distances in Congo, all that plays a role in terms of also investing enough to produce and exploit those assets to a scale that is profitable, and getting it over to the Middle East to get turned into cash, and then using that cash to pay for your operations is difficult. Prigozhin had deep pockets and personal pockets, and he could also leverage the state. And he had like an insane risk tolerance that he felt that he could take these like massive gambles in the hopes that they would pay off. And it's more difficult for Western PMCs, I think, to structure that kind of deal, even if the Trump administration is like all gung ho about get rid of AFRICOM and just use American PMCs. There would still be a lot of American PMC requests, I think,
Mhm.
for funding as well.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, a member of a Western PMC while I was traveling, I'm not going to say exactly where, knew that I was in country and said, we really need to meet. I didn't have much time. So we ended up going to a bar and which was loud, obnoxious and everything. And I think the imagination that they have of what was possible in African countries wildly differs to reality. Right. And I told them that. I said, I don't think that you're gonna, you know, if a Western government or an Eastern government is getting involved in these places, the money that they are paying is going to influence. It's not going to go to business and making money back because, as you said, the economics of it, they don't make sense. Even if we look at the old model of, oil and gas and, these type of things. Obviously, the situation in Ukraine has put everyone on notice, particularly the Europeans. I think European governments have been sleeping at the wheel for far too long and did not understand, first of all, their responsibility, but also the threat for not being self sufficient. And I think this like multipolar world that I think we're already in it. I mean, we've seen the move from countries like Hungary sending
Mhm.
troops to Chad. I don't know if it ended up happening, but that
I
was
think they
like,
landed. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, I think that was a move, to stem immigration. A crazy move, but I think the prices paid is also something that the government can point to its people and say, see, we are actually doing something at the front lines of this, and um and I think for the US, and particularly US companies, there will be a lot of interest, obviously, in Mexico and Venezuela. I mean, where Trump now reversed some of the concessions the Biden administration gave the Maduro regime. So let's see how that plays out. I think this might give a rise to even countries within the EU start doing things on their own outside of the framework of the EU because Hungary is part of the EU and this is a unilateral move. This is not in conjunction with any European. And there is this skepticism, right, of the European Union. And particularly Brexit happened and now with the German elections. And so I think the world is becoming a lot more interesting, but also a lot more dangerous. And I think we're going to see this fight for because every time I meet somebody in government, the first question is critical minerals.
Mhm.
You and I have been talking about it for years,
Mhm.
and that's more. And I mean, the question of Greenland, Ukraine peace deal, DRC right now, Afghanistan before. A lot of it was critical minerals, and also another thing is that we're not just talking about rare earth minerals, right? Because a lot more resources have become critical now.
Mhm.
So now I think even things like aluminium are part of critical minerals now,
Mhm.
right? And so we are seeing this mad dash for how do I secure that?
And that's where private companies can position themselves
Absolutely.
in what is I think difficult, what makes the environment kind of more difficult, I mean, you tackle it in the book, but people are always obsessed with what's private, what's public, what's the state, what is I mean, it's like, oh, what is Wagner's relationship to the state, right? And it's like in real life, there are clear-cut binaries, kind of clear-cut borders between state and private enterprise, especially in the national security space where you have what people would call here the revolving door between these companies that work very closely with US intelligence, very closely with the US military, and, Wagner was a version of that with very Russian characteristics, but in this new world, it becomes more difficult to understand quite, like, who is who. Prigozhin was like an expert in straddling that ambiguity, right? And when it was of use to him, Wagner was a commercial enterprise. When it was of use to him, Wagner was the Russian state. Even if, he didn't have as much backing of the Russian state as he pretended to. And so when it came to dealing with the Central African government, Prigozhin positioned what he was doing as you're partnering with the Russian state. Now, some guys in the Russian Ministry of Defense probably had a different like view of what
Yeah, we found out.
Prigozhin was. Yeah, they found out later on
Yeah.
what Prigozhin was out there doing. That exists to a certain extent in all places, right? That people position themselves and try to take advantage of the ambiguity. It's gonna be even more so as we go forward, as more and more countries have some sort of version of this, and it's very difficult to kind of parse out exactly whose interests are behind it. The reality is usually that it's many or a mixture of both.
Yeah, I think let's call it more isolationist or domestic focus of the US, depending who you ask, will embolden more countries to go after these things because there's a power vacuum in a lot of these places. Even if the US was not actively involved, it was still in the sphere of influence. So people had to think twice. And where do you think that this industry, from a Russian perspective, but also from an international perspective, where do you think we're going to go with this? What do you think the next couple of years will look like?
I think that the private kind of what PMC's offering will probably go more in the direction of what Wagner was offering because Wagner created a market, and especially as we kind of continue down this Cold War 2.0 kind of great power competition road, like over time, the methods and the practices of the opponents tend to mirror each other because everyone always thinks that we're living in extraordinary circumstances that demand extraordinary measures, and it's we can no longer play by the old rules, right? And so when all sides believe that, there tends to be kind of a convergence around models. And so I think there will be now more, and it might not necessarily come this time around from Russia because there's going to be a reluctance now for there's been a degree of kind of overextension for the Russians right now in Africa. There's no real desire to put another force akin to Wagner into the Sahel like Burkina or something like that. There's not a desire from the Burkinabe either, but you could see others kind of using that model of sort of state-backed PMCs that are really participating in offensive, military operations, the Turkeys of the world, Rwanda, the UAE, and this is something that I think we've talked about before, but if we do see a ceasefire in Ukraine, you're going to see an explosion in the PMC space as both the Russians and the Ukrainians look for ways to get these highly trained soldiers out of out of their country and to other places. And the PMC type structures, the Russians have already been doing it. Obviously, the Ukrainians will have the mechanisms for that as well. And so I think that could be another kind of explosion in that space where those guys are once again offering the services of people who have the most experience in modern warfare.
I mean, we saw a glimpse of that in Sudan,
A glimpse,
right?
for sure.
Yeah, where they were, even though that was state backed, and in Syria. But it's going to be an interesting.
And I think you and I know people who, for a fact, are going to be salivating when there's a ceasefire because of simply the pools of fighters for recruitment are going to be
Huge.
are going to be huge. Yeah. And this is not something that's new. I mean, you just have to look at the whoever's in the French Foreign Legion to get a sense of, which states are in post-conflict because, you know, after the 90s, it was a lot of, uh, people from former Yugoslavia who were fighting in the French Foreign Legion.
Yeah, yeah.
Then it became Russians and Ukrainians.
There's a lot of Ukrainians now.
A lot of Ukrainians now. There were a lot of Russians too. A lot of those guys joined Wagner and were useful for their French skills. And it's going to be a similar pool again if there's a ceasefire.
So, in this part of the podcast, I always ask for anybody looking to follow in your footsteps and what you've been doing, especially young people. What advice would you give them?
I think you can manifest a lot of things in life by just giving a voice to it. And for me, it's still a bit unreal, but I took some risks because I thought that this was,
That's an understatement.
story. Yeah. Yeah. But also career opportunity costs, things along those lines. I basically just started telling people that I'm writing a book, and it's incredible that people will take you seriously. And so you just got to keep telling people and act like you're doing it. And there is something to fake it till you make it, I suppose, because
Absolutely. Yeah.
I didn't have any, particular background in this stuff, but I just was basically like, I'm going to do it. And
Yeah.
if you tell people and you're confident about it, they kind of like open the door for you. It's really bizarre. So
Yeah. Crazy how that works, huh? I mean, I would say, from my observations over the last couple of years, is that you have a mindset where I think you always are thinking, why not? Let's just try it, right?
Mhm.
And I think that fearlessness that you have, I think it's hard to, I mean, something you build or something you're born with, but I think that's, I think, immense, right? I think you're one of the few people that is like, let me see. And you try it out, right? Most people, they don't do that. And it is obviously to say a very intelligent guy, a successful guy, but I think that mindset and success go hand in hand. Because if you don't, you just kind of stay where you are. So
That's true.
you're 100% right on that.
Yeah. I think my wife
Last
would
thing,
want me to tone down my fearlessness a little bit. So,
I can imagine.
yeah, if she's listening to this, she's going to be like,
I mean, you know, I'm in the same
really?
boat.
Like you're a devil. Yeah, yeah,
You know,
yeah.
but your book comes out on the 4th of March, and it will be in the show notes. It will be available it is, if you pre-order it, you can get it already on Amazon, most good book places. What are you reading, listening to, or watching right now? Do you have any cultural recommendations outside of your own fantastic book?
So bizarrely, kind of in my free time, or not bizarrely, maybe. I mean, I read a lot of fiction. I read a lot of novels. I think that helps me understand how people live their lives and how to uh, tell people's story. And I think you empathize a lot more with an individual than you do with kind of like grand history, population, thousands of people displaced. It's tough. That's intangible. I think you can empathize more and you can learn more about how the structures or a country works by following the trajectory of an individual. So I read a lot of fiction, and I'm just finishing up right now as sort of research for my next book. What's it called? It's called America's Great War for the Middle East by Basevich,
Mhm.
and he takes you through military history of U.S. intervention, and this is Middle East for him broadly defined as, from Afghanistan, obviously through what we think of as the Middle East to, Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia. And it's a military history that takes you through the Cold War, First Gulf War, Kosovo, Second Gulf War, War on Terror. And I think he's an amazing writer. He is a retired Marine, and I would say also very critical of of kind of America's understanding of how America understood the Middle East and how it thought it could fix the Middle East problems. And there's a lot of hubris that entails. And so it's fascinating to always see kind of everything tied together in a way from, Carter all the way through to today.
Interesting. And any guilty pleasures?
Oh yeah, my wife and I watched The Real Housewives on Bravo for sure.
Fair enough.
I used to not. I don't really watch TV on my own, and
Yeah.
my wife is a big fan of reality TV.
Yeah.
And so when I watch TV, I really only watch like
With her.
with her, and it's just like pure, just like Real Housewives. I mean, it's just like women
It's
screaming
more
at
than
each
drama.
other. It's so much drama. It's an insane amount of drama. But to their credit, it's like really good. And it's
Yeah.
like WWE like wrestling is for
For
women.
women.
Like, oh my God, yeah.
Not
Like the
saying that
story,
WWE is not for women, but I think
plenty of women love
yeah,
WWE
yeah.
too. But I mean it's that same kind of, I mean, it's these like soap operas, right? There's just, it's fascinating, and it's I have to admit it's good TV.
Who am I to judge? Because I watch Love Is Blind with my wife.
Oh
So
yeah. Oh yeah. I
I
watch
cannot
Love Is
really,
Blind with my wife too. Yeah.
yeah, I cannot really say anything again.
And you always pretend to like be like, "Oh man," and then like
Yeah.
halfway through, you're like, "He did fucking what?" Like, "Oh
Yeah.
man," like,
How dare he?
yeah,
And there's like,
this guy is trouble. Like,
I
he doesn't
know.
know how to respect women, huh?
Yeah. No, hilarious.
Yeah.
John, thank you so much, man, for your time.
Thank you, man.
I
Always
always
good.
feel like when we talk, and now it's in a podcast, but doesn't really matter. But
This was
I
basically a normal
right, this
conversation.
is
Yeah,
organization.
yeah,
I feel like I learned so much, and I never get tired of hearing your perspective on things because it's so measured and balanced. I would say even for a lot of like young researchers, check out John's work. And if you listen to this podcast, I definitely do not heap any praise on people's books that much as I do in yours, because I've been talking about your book to everybody that wants to hear it for the last couple of years.
that, yeah,
So
thank God.
so I'm as much of a fan as a contemporary, and
Oh, we got to get
it's,
you a copy over to you.
I want a signed
Pretty
copy.
soon. Yeah,
I
yeah,
need a signed copy. Maybe we could
for
do a
sure.
giveaway
For sure.
also for
Yeah, for sure.
the
Yeah,
listener.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
We've done that before. But yeah, again, thank you so much for your time, and really looking forward to what you do next.
Thank you, sir. Look forward to talking soon.
All right. And for anybody listening, thank you guys for support. I know we've been, depending on exactly when this podcast comes out, we've been away for a while. And thank you guys for the patience. There's a lot of episodes banked as I go into the Ramadan. And I don't do recordings then. So after that, so the whole month of March we have covered, and April we will have to. So it's good, and yeah, thank you to everybody for the patience and the support on everything. Talk to you guys soon. John, again, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Cheers.